Dallas. So evening to everyone from Dallas Fort Worth Airport. So if you see movement around me, it's probably a lot of people in the background. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, and good. Hey, Michelle. So the camera's back, good. And BJ's back. Everybody's starting to roll in. I do have a presentation tonight, but I did want to start. One, I always want to say this. I do appreciate your processing online before class. It kind of helps me to think through some of the pieces. And I'll go ahead and call out John Wakefield. You were only supposed to read through the end of chapter 5 instead of the closing component. So if everybody read John's and went, wait, did I miss something? No, you didn't. My plan is actually to have you come back to the book, Sheldrake's book, at the end of the semester. I think what he does at the last part is helpful now, but I also think it's something that would be really helpful as you're thinking about writing your own position paper. So hang on to the book and hang on to John's comments, and that way it'll go ahead and give you a clue going forward. John's like, I just can't take you anywhere, right? So, okay, never mind. Real quick question. This is the first week you've had to interact with the workbook. So were you surprised with this week's exercises? Just a general comment from anyone about how the exercises flowed for the week?
I found them extremely. Oh,
go ahead.
Can you hear? I was just going to say I found them extremely helpful. Like extremely, extremely helpful. And I was definitely taken off guard to start by writing a letter to myself from Jesus. But at the same time, and then in the same breath, like it did this thing of kind of paving what went with the rest of the week, that in a really powerful way that helped me start by feeling loved by Jesus and seen and heard and appreciated. So that then, I don't know, carried over into helping me do that then with others. So.
Right. Other observations, anyone? No? Okay. Well, I'm not going to hold you up. This is why you have your small group conversation. One of the things that you're going to discover in every one of the lessons, we have a tendency to start from what I call the God perspective. And this is actually also taking very seriously our own humanity and our relationships with others. And part of the way the curriculum is designed is to, again, just help us recognize how deeply we're related to each other and how God is at work in those relationships. So I hope that makes sense to everybody from that standpoint. And yeah, the first time I've been through the work before, but the first time I had to write a letter from Jesus to me, it was like awkward to the max. And trust me, I wouldn't even let my wife read that letter. So I hope you hear there's a lot of the work that's going on in here that you can hold to yourselves. I do hope, though, you have good conversations with each other. First couple of weeks, we'll do about 30 minutes. As we get a little bit later into this first half of the semester and you get to know each other, we may shorten that a little bit, but always part of the work during the week is the workbook so that when you come together, the time is beneficial for how you're engaging with each other. Okay. I think one thing I will say, I think there's a kind of go homer each week. So if you're one of those kind of people who go, well, I don't know if I'll get it all done, but I'll definitely get the last couple of lessons wrapped up before I show up for class. Obviously, then things like writing letters and arranging to meet with someone else, doing some of the action elements might catch up with you. So you might, thinking about your own rhythm, you might want to make sure you leave a buffer Sunday, Monday, so you might have opportunity to actually capitalize on some of those exercises. The good news is we'll do this again. We're going to go through this twice in the semester. So you'll have another opportunity to kind of walk through the process before the semester's over. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay, is everybody hoping my flight gets called early? Is that the thing? No? Okay, all right.
Of course not.
Okay.
What,
Um,
Dr. Blevins? What did you
yes.
say about, what did you say about chapter 6 on the on Sheldrake's book?
The last little go homer component, I thought, unless I actually wrote it down incorrectly, and John, you can correct me if I did write it down incorrectly. But I thought I left that off, and I'll talk more about that in the presentation, partially in hopes that you would revisit that toward the end of the semester. But I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. John, am I right or wrong? Somebody hold me up on that.
The syllabus says 4 through 6 and conclusion. And that's what I
conclusion?
read.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I read.
My bad. My bad. Okay, then. So John's off the hook. I'm the one that's on the hook at this point. So, okay, this is just so me, particularly this semester. So I apologize. Well, I'm going to take time to kind of walk through a presentation, if you don't mind. And if you, is the background noise impeding a lot, or am I coming through okay? All right, then I want you to know, let's do our usual shtick. Let me first share. And then everybody can put in the little bullets so you can see each other, and you will, Marie's got this as a PDF, so we can make this available to you at the end. So let me do this. So can everybody see my screen? My PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes, sir.
All righty, thank you. And let me, this is the first time I have to do everything on one screen, so it may get a little awkward at points. Do want to talk about life, beauty, and justice at the margins, 3 that we've been talking about for this portion. Just a kind of general note, if you were to, I think I mentioned this last week, if you were to spend time studying the history of Christian spirituality, the 2 primary areas from last week, the ascetic and the mystical, really do provide probably the largest areas of engagement in any sort of a historical sort of engage with. And frankly, most of the practices that we would understand traditionally as Christian spirituality would still sort of resonate with these 2 dominant spheres, sort of this idea of a disciplined living out the one spirituality, normally it really in service of mission, a lot of times, this ascetical approach, or this more receptive encounter with the presence of God, this sort of mystical approach. But sort of like Margaret Miles last week, there are larger approaches to understanding Christian spirituality as a whole, and Sheldrake's Big 5, if you will, is it's kind of a helpful organizing piece. For some of you, it may look a little bit similar to another Catholic theologian by the name of Avery Dulles. He wrote a book called Models of the Church that he used to kind of provide 6 sort of representative families of churches. And for him, the language of model was intentional to kind of say you can overlay this in any congregation. And when you overlay it, it tells you a little bit more about the nature of what that church is, but also what that church is not. In other words, how certain churches come closer or to the model, or sometimes don't quite fit at all. Dulles wrote the first edition of his book, and he only had 5 models. And when people ask, so what's the best version? He resisted that. Then he revised the book about 15 years later and actually added a 6th version called The Church is the Way of Disciples, which was kind of his envisioning of the best of all possible worlds. And I think Sheldrake's conclusion comes close to that. So for us, I think one thing you have to do is sort of recognize the fullness of each of these other approaches. And then when you turn to that conclusion, think about how it informs you. That may be part of what we'll talk about all through the rest of the semester as we keep going. Okay. By the way, if anybody has a question, just interrupt. I can't see all the faces. I did want to start with beauty instead, kind of taking things out of order. And part of the reason is that in some ways, beauty to the practical wisdom or really then moves toward the prophetic in a lot better flow from a standpoint of the presentation. Often the Christian life really does reflect an ascetic vision of God. And a lot of the approach to understanding the spiritual formation through beauty many times begins with creation, but it extends to our vision of Christ and also the redemptive life. By the way, the icon that you see there is a kind of Celtic component, and it's taken actually from an InterVarsity website that's dedicated toward beauty, and particularly through the work of Betty Dixon. And so if you look up, we'll talk more about Visio Divina, but if you look up her name and look up InterVarsity, there are a series of exercises there where she has basically committed to a whole host of paintings, taking you through the whole order of creation and redemption, and provides exercises if you're interested in this kind of aesthetic approach. Now, frankly, beauty can be reflective in sight, sound, and symbol. When it comes to symbol, it can be understood a lot of times in a kind of poetic fashion, but it's also reflective of liturgy and architecture as well. It's not surprising that Sheldrake would spend a whole lot of time on cathedrals. The very architecture of most cathedrals are designed to do one thing, and that is to cause us to look up. And as we look up, we attend to the fullness of who God is. It's really fascinating. If you look at cathedrals in Eastern Orthodoxy, often as you look up, the top of the cathedral or the church is a vision of either the Trinity or the image of Christ staring down at you. It's a pretty amazing experience to see that and to be involved in particularly an Eastern Orthodox cathedral and have that kind of an experience. Now, to be honest with you, the church sometimes struggles with its attention to beauty. There are two very famous periods in the history of the church. The first one is in the 8th and 9th centuries during the iconoclastic controversies basically in Byzantium, in what would later be known as the Eastern Orthodox Church. So it was all one church at that point, where the veneration of icons were challenged pretty strenuously, and a lot of actually really good theology sort of defending what beauty is about came out of the defense of those icons. The other one is interestingly does also come with the rise of the Reformation, and particularly an emphasis on Puritan simplicity. And for some of you who've been in New England and know the kind of plain clapboard churches that are there, where the pulpit occupies the center, and doesn't seem to be there's a kind of austerity to how the chapels are configured. It is a kind of dedication to Puritan simplicity over and against the distraction of beauty. But I've always been fascinated that the self-same Puritans who like that simplicity in their structures really had tremendous hymnody a lot of times and great oratory. So it's not surprising that someone like Jonathan Edwards, who we actually sometimes read in English classes, or at least I think people still do, his oratory might have actually occurred in some fairly simple churches. But there is still the beauty in the way in which the word turned is a part of this approach and this trajectory. One place that this has been very important for me is in and through artwork. Friedrich Buechner wrote a book called The Faces of Jesus, and he collaborated with actually a photographer by the name of Lee Bolton. And it is probably one of the most profound pieces of capturing different sort of understandings of who Jesus is from around the world. So yes, there are a number of pictures in that book on Madonna and Child, though often from other cultures and often reflective of the artwork of that place. And there are expressions of who Jesus is, yes, through the Western Church, also through the Middle Ages, when Jesus looked really quite European, to some rather intriguing expressions of who Jesus is, particularly through his death and resurrection. And it just reminds us that, yes, Christ has a face, but there are many ways to sort of represent who Jesus is, to sort of capture the fullness of how we understand Christ and the work of Christ in and around the world today. Probably the one place that this is best known is through the practice of Visio Divina. And Michelle, Stephen, Michelle, I know in your comments, all three of you sort of connected to beauty. And I think, Michelle, you were the one who said, so where's Visio Divina? Well, it's there. I don't know. I think Sheldrake loves English mystics more and privileges that in some ways. But there is this kind of practice, if you will, of engaging art in a very deliberative way. Those of you who know the Lectio Divina, you've heard that language of divine reading, knows that that is a kind of patterned engagement that often brings us into contact with the same text, sometimes 2 or 3 different times, depending on how the Lectio is designed, so that we hear the text afresh and anew and enter into the text in a really different way than our sort of commanding and mastering that text. Well, Visio Divina is designed to do the same thing, particularly with artwork. I am a fan of Rublev's icon on the Trinity, and it's been an important piece for me. But you might have other forms of artwork, even just the beauty of creation, where you would practice this. And those of you who read the book might remember Sheldrake mentions Richard St. Victor and his kind of way of entering in from a kind of everyday engagement with reading or artwork to moving to a more deeper awareness. Visio Divina can take up to 4 practices, but normally about 2 is normally the traditional practice. The first one is looking at a piece of art. You just gaze at it. You look slowly and thoroughly. You kind of take it at a glance. Note the colors, the movement, the textures. It's really at least appreciating the fullness of the work the first time, and you respond to that, to the image with a prayer to God. So that becomes a way in which you begin. Then you then go back and take a second look, a deeper look. You try to rest within the presence of the image, and you allow yourself to use your imagination to find yourself within the art or within that moment of creation, not unlike writing a letter and then reading it as if it comes from Jesus. So it's much deeper investment into the work. And then again, you respond with prayer. Now, there are several books on icons. Actually, Henry Nouwen wrote a nice little treatment on them. One of the things about icons is that icons sort of have this ability to provide, in the way they're designed, a kind of intentional 3D experience. That may sound odd, because they are really designed to, where we normally would look at art and we sort of master that art, where we are the knower of the art. Icons have a tendency to reach out into us and then draw us into the fullness of that artwork. And so iconography is really trying to bring us into the very artwork in such a way that it invites us into not just the mind of the painter, but actually the implicit message of these images of God, Christ, the saints, that is pretty profound. I will go ahead and say that I provided for you an example of Visio Divina on the website so that you can download a PDF where you can go through the exercise. And I'll say more about that at the end of the presentation. Well, if Visio Divina brings us into the very beauty of God, particularly through the well, the imagery, the timber, um, the rhythms of the fullness of the aesthetic vision. Practical action actually flips that and takes that vision of how God is at work in these very unique expressions and brings it into the everyday. Truthfully, this approach is pretty much indebted to the Reformation, but it and so it's not surprising we're involved, but it really started sooner than that in a kind of return to spirituality in the everyday, reflective of the common life of movements that started with the reading of the Devotio Moderna and others, and particularly Gerhard Brut's work in the Brothers of the Common Life. And there was a kind of movement to try to begin to think about how laity and actually monks who were trying to bring about reform to the church could find the spirituality at work in everyday life, though it would often include, as Sheldrake says, some interesting elements of both asceticism and mysticism, even in this everyday spirituality. Luther probably is the one we know who best sort of communicated this. During the Reformation, one of the things Luther thought that was important was that by the time of the Reformation, there was a kind of threefold stratified view of the spiritual life, if you will, kind of hierarchy with a monk at the top, the priests who had become the religious, thanks to Gregory the Great, and then the laity. And it's not surprising whether it was through worship of the Mass or other forms of spirituality, this sort of threefold framework was out there. And not, I will go ahead and mention, also implicit behind this was the hierarchy of the divine right of kings and even the emperor in conjunction with the Pope. And so Luther really wanted to flatten that hierarchy. He desired to see the spiritual life through his theology that we were justified by grace through faith, to be returned to everyday folk so they could live their spiritual lives out in the midst of the workplace and the family. And so a living vocation became an expression of both faith, outwardly expressed, but also inner devotion. And everyday extemporaneous prayer, Bible reading, attending church, devotional began to support one's everyday spirituality in and through this kind of an approach. And then the language of piety, which actually began to sort of emerge about this time, became both an expression of living this daily spiritual life, but also it was a goal that was sort of reflected in these movements that we were to live pious lives. I hope that makes sense. And so it was both a goal, but often you'd say, well, how do you know you're living out this faith? Well, it was how your piety was sort of expressed in and through your everyday life, including how it was expressed in your family and then expressed in your everyday life as you would then give account to that witness, if you will, back within the life of the church. Hope that makes sense. It's not surprising, and I was looking, I think Amber and Cheryl, you guys started it in the comments, but it's not surprising that for many of us, we might resonate with this approach out of at least our history and heritage. It's probably reflective of most contemporary evangelical spirituality, even to today, where the emphasis is on reading the Bible, praying, trying to engage in a kind of heartfelt Christian living is sort of the markers of the Christian faith. And there is nothing wrong with that. It's just that over and opposed to other forms of spiritual formation really were sort of at least lost in the conversation around this particular version of sort of faith lived out as dedicated, pious Christians. There were some theological tensions, so I'm just going to name some of those. One of the most fascinating ones, excuse me, was with Calvinism. I mean, so you have a doctrine of the elect, right? You have tulip, and you have the irresistibility of grace, And so why in the world would you want to do these spiritual practices? As a matter of fact, even as a Lutheran, why would you do any spiritual practices if you thought for a moment they might save you instead of faith saving you? But definitely those who were part of the Presbyterian order where the elect was there, what was spiritual formation all about to begin with? Well, there are some really interesting texts, particularly in the 16th and 17th century, written by not so much Calvin, but written by the followers of Calvinism, where they would go, well, what does the doctrine, what do the elect tend to look like? If you are elect of God, and and this is important within a Calvin ecclesiology and soteriology, and you come to recognize your election. You don't earn it, but you at least come to recognize it. So what it would look like to live the elect life? Well, suddenly it starts to look a lot like, well, some of these other practices of Bible and praying and Christian living, kind of that way. And it's fascinating looking at this literature as it moves from a kind of descriptive to what I would call a mildly prescriptive approach within Calvinist and other Reformed traditions, where they might say, it may not save you, but at least if you are serious about participating within God's election, these are the things you ought to undertake as a result of that. Now, truthfully, this when it shows up, particularly in the United States, this Puritan simplicity, if you will, is also encased in some really different points of struggle. One is the high contrast between law and gospel. There's a tendency to view people as radically evil and inclined thereto. And so if you're waiting for that kind of break of grace, how do you begin to help people sort of understand their growth spiritually after they go through some kind of radical conversion? And so spiritual formation almost becomes postponed. And then a lot of times the spiritual formation is sort of cast in a kind of really struggle with a sinful world. How do you stay faithful in the midst of this sinful world? So the real dichotomy between sort of sin, a deep pervasiveness of sin, if you will think about it that way, and also this participation to try to be faithful can create really obstacles. Create a lot of obstacles for children, for sure, because often, as Horace Bushnell and others observed, we might love kids until they became, well, preteens, and then we would tell them they were completely evil and inclined thereto. And if you have a preteen, you might tend to agree with that. But then all of a sudden they had to drop into this heavy conversion emphasis, and often that created lots of questions. It does at times challenge us also, because there are times inside this movement, not saying it happens everywhere in all places, you don't hear this as a critique of the whole approach, where spirituality can be shaped by a kind of heightened view of the world, where we see the world as dangerous. And suddenly the whole goal of our spiritual formation is to try to protect us from either the fear of contamination from outside or the fear of degradation from within. And I have known communities of faith, and I've read books on spiritual formation that have tended to emphasize this component, where it becomes more of a cautionary narrative that sometimes, I guess the best way I want to say it is, we need to be aware of whether we agree with it or not. John says toddlers are evil too. It's been so long since my daughter was a toddler. I might resemble that, but she would want the opportunity to offer a counter narrative at that point. So I better be careful what I say. Okay. Well, so I do want to finish thinking about this whole area of sort of practical discipline, practical action, by recognizing that one of the what I would call practical wisdom embedded within this tradition is that there's a very intentional attempt to return spirituality to the experience of everyday people in everyday life. So, John, your question about is this life at large? And I would have said, in some ways, trying to recognize where a lot of the books today are trying to keep a broader descriptive understanding of Christian spirituality. If I were to teach this course, albeit in the Middle Ages, I would have said no, because it is really this level of spiritual formation and spiritual practices are only for the priest, only for the extreme religious, if you will. And not that seduction doesn't fall into our own clergy education at times, but that would have been a really radically different response. Back in those days, thinking of everyday laity of even capable of this kind of depth of relationship with God would be hard within some of the models of spiritual formation, ascetical and mystical models in those days. It's not exclusive, it's just the stratification was there. This whole emphasis, thanks to the Reformation, of kind of bringing this back into the conversation with everyday life becomes really important, because then suddenly even the kind of spirituality of engagement that we have at the cathedral in the midst of worship must always have a ripple effect into the fullness of everyday life. And it helps us to see formation not only through focused times of prayer, worship, and devotion, but also in the struggles and triumphs of life. And both of those are held together. I always find interesting where Wesley shows up in these books. Some of you know that I've done my own work in John Wesley and formation, his approach to Christian formation. So I just wanted to mention Sheldrake. And I do think this is important. Sheldrake's acknowledgement of what I call a sacramental twist when it comes to Wesley. So Sheldrake wrote, while concerned with personal experiential faith, Wesley fostered love and service of neighbor, particularly the poor and needy, and a spirituality that combined prayer and action. The universal need for salvation drove his missionary activity. Wesley assumed that his followers would continue to attend normal Church of England services, and he had a high view of the Eucharist, both theologically and in terms of encouraging frequent communion. And that Sheldrake that's a fair sort of synopsis of Wesley from that standpoint. And I do want to say that if there is a sphere that hasn't been addressed carefully in Sheldrake's book, kind of understanding of spirituality in and through the sacraments would be an interesting treatise to think about right alongside these other five approaches. So I just wanted to mention that in passing. Well, this, in some ways, the practical takes us to the prophetic. And one way to think about this is because the prophetic resembles the practical in its concern for the everyday, but particularly in the everyday life of people who live on the margins of our society, of our world. And its emergence as a type probably is deeply indebted to the rise in South American liberation theology. I am almost certain that Sheldrake is deeply influenced, first and foremost, out of the work of Gustavo Gutierrez and others in the way in which they highlighted the need to bring this kind of approach to the conversation. But it does have deep roots and movements associated with peace and justice, particularly within the Catholic Church. And you will find books written in this genre, prophetic books, on the spirituality and the preservation of the environment. In a previous generation, you would have found a series of books actually on Christian spirituality and the threat of nuclear proliferation. We don't think about that as often these days, though it still becomes painfully obvious sometimes through our news reports. But there were other expressions of peace and justice prior to our most current era that adopted this, including, well, the Catholic Workers Society, Dorothy Day, and others that really kind of represent this. But social action and justice was not only a pursuit, but a way of life for some who were participating within this. So there were people who were working as advocates or allies, we might use that language today, But you need to understand part of this prophetic work was really being done by the very people who were participating within that way of life. And they were the ones who were deeply at work, providing the resources, even for those of us who would see ourselves as advocates and allies in this movement. It is expressive. The Mendicant movement, which was a movement that included Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross. It was part of the Catholic Reformation after the Protestant Reformation, where these movements, Carmelite movements of all things, really moved into a radical association with the poor again. And these mendicant nuns and priests, all began to enter into the everyday margins of people's lives who were the poor, and to begin to talk about the very presence of Christ in the midst of those. I do think with the rise of social class, I might use the word caste for those of you who are taking Dr. Wesley's book, that whole emphasis did create a number of concerns, particularly around those who live their lives in liminal spaces today. Howard Thurman being maybe one of the best examples of that. And most of us know is through his writing of Jesus and the Disinherited. Those of you who've had to read that at some point. But his Celebration of Disciplines book is as powerful a text as any that I have in those selected readings in this class. An interesting example of this is a book that is been very helpful for me, by Donald Dorr. Dorr's an interesting person. He's an Irish Catholic missionary who did most of his ministry both in South America and in environmental struggles. And he wrote a book called Integral Spirituality. Those of you who have actually hung around with me in missional theology know that South America, instead of missional, they use the word integral as a way of understanding that engagement. So Dorr drew that and brought that into this conversation. I've always liked it because the way he utilizes the language of Micah 6:8, you know, what do we call for other than to act justly, walk humbly, act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before our Lord. And in that book, he creates a model of spirituality and spiritual formation that calls for, well, working towards structural justice, interpersonal respect, and personal integrity and responsibility, that calls for ecological sensitivity, participative community building, and absolute transparency between those and the people that we're called to work with and participate with to bring about this kind of holistic transformation that Dorr describes as shalom. And Dorr's just one book among many of this movement, so it's not that I privilege it alone, but it has been for me one of the more helpful texts to see how this whole movement can be organized in a way that provides structure and helps even people like myself enter into it without necessarily having to participate within life on the margins. There was actually a book, it was actually a religious education text that was written by a group of educators in the 1990s called Pedagogies of the Non-Poor. And it was a fascinating text in trying to say, how do we help people who live lives of affluence understand how they participate within this prophetic liberative process, and how do they find themselves in the midst of that journey? I close with just a random thought. I've always been really impressed with the writing of Paulo Freire, who's an educator, a liberative educator. One of the things Freire once said that has always been profound, and heard him say this. He says that liberation theology is not necessarily about taking those who are on the margins and those who are at the top, and then raising those on the margins up. It is also, and bringing those on the top down. But it is about, in some ways, bringing both. It is helping those who rise, those who are on the margins, and those who are in privilege to come together so that we not merely replicate another hierarchical injustice, but the goal of liberative pedagogy is to free both the oppressor and the oppressed so we can find a new way forward. And Freire's it's always been helpful from Freire's perspective to remind me it really is about a mutual liberation that's going on that is fully redemptive for everyone who participates in this process. I will say that if you engage in this particular form of spirituality, it can be difficult for those of us, and I'll just say it this way, those of us who are part of the privileged community, partially because, many times I do think we want to listen to the voices that are from the margins and those who are speaking on behalf of those for the margins, but sometimes defining the margins can be very difficult. And it really calls for a kind of spirituality and border crossing, where a lot of times as those of us who are privileged, move into these marginal cultures, we encounter those narratives, we have to understand that we are still a part of that dominant culture. That we can't just, by becoming allies, enter into that marginal culture and forget that we still are representative of the broader culture that we're a part of. And learning to live on those borders, to learn to hear that the voice of the prophetic is going to speak critique to us. And when they talk about the critique of the dominant culture, they're going to speak critique to us. And we receive that, if no other reason than to prepare us then to be able to move into the fullness of moving alongside them as advocates and allies, that we're willing to live in the tension of what I call, in some ways, the already and the not yet. That there's still continued struggle from the margins, and it has not yet occurred that we ourselves are freed from where we live in the midst of that struggle. And really the toughest thing is to listen to the pain, but let me stress this, but also the resilience of the voices on the margins, undergirded by their understanding of the work of God. That is really important. A lot of times I get nervous, maybe this is just an older professor speaking, when we listen to the margins and all we can talk about is their suffering and pain, and we sometimes miss the depth of their resilience. Now, the other way around, and I've seen this happen, where people idealize the poor and sometimes say, oh, isn't their life just simple and isn't wonderful, when actually the poor don't want to be poor. Sounds good when we're looking down and say, I wish I had a simple life like that. Yeah, let you worry about where the next meal's coming from, and you might not think that way. But I do think hearing the resilience of people who have found a way to nevertheless find God in the midst of their marginalization is an important process in this sort of prophetic approach to spirituality. I'm going to pause for just a moment. Any questions so far? Anything coming up from anybody? Well, I'm doing this. No? Okay. All right. Let me keep going. There are some places, I'm just going to suggest one, where these different spheres overlap. And one of the places that I personally love is where liberation, this prophetic tradition, meets beauty and a spirituality of beauty, and not to see those as exclusive of each other. A good friend of mine, Yolanda Smith, who's since deceased, she was a colleague of mine, and then taught, African-American who taught at Yale Divinity School for a number of years, wrote her dissertation on reclaiming the spirituals. And she wrote the dissertation primarily with an African-American audience in mind. And her work is representative of others, including Howard Thurman's writing and James H. Cone's writing, on how the spirituals and even the blues do represent a really powerful intersection between the prophetic, the liberative approach to spirituality, and finding beauty in the midst of that. and the power of what you hear in the singing of the spirituals and the rhythm, the timbre that reflects, so this is Dr. Smith's language, an African heritage, an African American heritage of survival and liberation, and a Christian heritage that all coalesce, is one of the best examples I know of how the prophetic and beauty intersect with each other. The spirituals we know began somewhere around 1750, so it is indicative of an African American heritage context, though it has deep African roots as well as deep struggles, and how African Americans were able to take what was in those days a white man's religion, I'll just say it that way, that was often used to tell them to be obedient in the midst of their slavery, and to find within that Christian story powerful counter narratives that through song, because they often were not allowed to preach, but through song, they could tell an entirely different gospel message that often was double coded. That means that it included code language for them to help them to escape slavery, but it also included a deep reliance upon the Christian tradition and Christian heritage. So songs like Steal Away, Roll Jordan Roll, Nobody Knows the Trouble I See, Go Down Moses, Wade in the Water, even Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and these are not the only ones, are tremendous, tremendous accounts of a different kind of hymnody that I think often we would do well to listen to within our many different traditions that are represented here in the class. So one thing I wanted to do, I'm going to close the PowerPoint in just a minute to take questions from everybody, but I'm intentionally, not just because I'm in an airport, trying to wrap up early so that you can use some time out of this class to do one of two things. One is if you've got a favorite painting or artwork, or even if you just have pictures of creation, things that you've captured, and you want to practice Visio Divina. And like I said, if you go to the Moodle site, this is one time where I wish I had all three of my monitors with me, you will find that available to you. So you can download a PDF, very simple instructions on how to use that. Or you could, there's a link there to the InterVarsity Press model, if you would like to, excuse me, InterVarsity Fellowship model, if you would like to go to that version. And it has actually videos are connected, so it can guide you from that standpoint. Or you might, the other thing I provided to you on the Moodle site is actually a series of YouTube videos of different spirituals. It has one video that kind of explains the history and heritage. You don't even have to watch that now. You can skip right over it. And then it has just several different songs, if you will, in really different contexts from everybody from some of the greatest gospel singers that we've known in the 20th century to some rather novel expressions of how those spirituals are represented, including one that actually from the movie 12 Years a Slave. So it's just a way of hearing those spirituals in different contexts and allowing them to speak to you. You might instead, if you wanted, to spend some time exploring how much your life is shaped through the practical wisdom of Protestant pietism. I hope you hear both embracing the fullness of that, the positive, but also asking some critical questions, particularly out of its, at times, some of the writers' deep indebtedness to kind of reformed roots and a reformed ecclesiology. And just think about the messages you've heard in your churches and how that might be expressed in that kind of spirituality. But I really want you to hear, I wouldn't want you to spend your whole time in that. We have plenty of time for critical analysis. I would rather you also think about the simply heartfelt religion that you yourself have participated in, that's everyday devotion. And think about how that is a part of your life. I mean, you spent a week looking on gratitude, so how could you even draw from this vision of that we go back to Devotio Moderna, this idea of a heartfelt faith, how you might give thanks for that and give gratitude as well might be something you would choose to do. Last thing I'll let you think about, and we're going to come back to the psychology of spirituality when we get together and convene. But one way to think about these three movements is obviously most of these movements are not apophatic. They do not stress what God is not, but they tend to be cataphatic. In other words, they tend to embrace imagery. Definitely beauty does that, whether it is through art or words or music, or everyday living that where we find God at work in the everyday. So this cataphatic component becomes what's going on at that point. Even in the prophetic, even in the over and againstness of the dominant culture that pushes people to the margins, there is a sense in which the very imagery that is a part of the Christian message can be flipped, if you will, and used in pretty creative ways. So all three of these movements tend to be more cataphatic in their orientation than apophatic. How much our engagement with that comes through the novelty of the mind or through the movement of the heart is something maybe we'll talk about later, but that might be something for you to think about. With music, is it the power of the lyrics? Is it the power of poetry that captures your mind in such a way that it inflames your imagination? Or in music, is it the rhythm, the timbre, just the majesty of the sound that draws your heart into the fullness of how you see your own spiritual journey? Knowing how you sort of fit within this ecology will be an ongoing conversation, but I hope you hear this ecology is really designed to help us understand the fullness of what Christian spirituality might employ to help us deepen our own spiritual journey. Okay? Well, I'm going to stop the share. Everybody wake up. Okay? Some bad news of doing this. Questions from the presentation. Any concerns, anything that you have that you want to bring up at this point? No? Anything I haven't addressed that's still left on the table to discuss?
I think for me, because I read the rest of the book, but I was really questioning, why do I need this? What am I going to do with it? It was good reading, but I just didn't understand it. So I definitely understand more, like the lyrics and the depthness of it. So after your lecture, I understand the chapter more than I did, because I'm like, this is crazy. I'm like, it has nothing to do with what I need, but obviously it does. And I do understand it more.
Yeah, and I want you to hear, Tara, in this survey, I'll name a couple things I'm hoping for. One is that you might find in Sheldrake's survey, which is what he's trying to do in reducing all of the history of Christian spirituality to this small a book, and then giving you almost what it feels like a name drop approach in this, is that you might find one writer, maybe a movement that just intrigues you, and you might want to explore it to its fullness, maybe throughout the rest of the semester. The other thing I'll say is most of us have been raised within one of these wells, if you will. I mean, I think we're beginning to name that, came up very much this week. That's good, but might there also be other elements from within these other traditions, if you will, these other approaches that might deepen and expand our own participation both of and in the Spirit of God in such a way that we might find our own self growing deeper and more richer as we engage these other traditions and bring them in as a part of what we do. Now, I will, and this will take us up to convene, so we've got more work to do up until then. I will talk about the danger of eclecticism But at this point, this is just an invitation to explore, not necessarily, and think about how these different traditions may inform your own spiritual journey. And if you'll hold that with loose hands, I think that's one way to think about what we're doing up to this point. John, looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting this week, and especially here in the lecture, like with the 5 different, you had a wonky Venn diagram with the 5 bubbles all kind of overlapping each other. I looked at that and I thought of people in my church and where do they land, and are all 5 represented, and are not all 5 represented, and why not, and why, in particular for me, why is asceticism not at St. Martin's Episcopal Church? Like I can see expressions of each of the other ones, but not that one in particular. So I'm going to leave this week in this book trying to figure out, like, does this inform how I can push forward in what we teach and talk about at our church, to make, not so that we're all leaning into one of them in particular, but so that the full kind of breadth of Christian spirituality is expressed.
And I think, I mean, I do think, and I'll say it this way, I do think that's part of Sheldrake's vision, is not to privilege one, but to invite us into any and all of these as we find, but either ourselves individually or find people in our churches that we might give guidance to from that standpoint. Colin, were you going to say something? I just saw a hand move. That might have been just a reflex. Nope. Okay. Other comments or questions? Other, you guys wondering how many colors my face will change with the shifting of the sun? No? Well, I really will give you, I want you to hear 30 minutes to actually wander into one of these expressions that I provided for you. So I hope you've got access to Moodle, you can find them. One of the things I discovered early in this journey into, and it started a little bit at NTS with one class that used to be offered in spiritual formation back in those days, but definitely in my doctoral work at Claremont, was the kind of breadth that's actually available to the Christian, to all Christians, that we often sometimes, just because, and the best way to say it is no harm, no foul. We were born to a particular tradition and a particular time and a particular place, so there's no fault here, but that we were not always fully exposed to the kind of range that we have available to ourselves. And not just ourselves individually, but in and through our ministries. And to begin to see the kind of breadth over more now than 2,000 years of sort of trying to find what it means to live both of and in the Spirit is a pretty amazing thing. And so I hope you'll be thinking about that. Now, next week, we do virtues. You'll have about a 1-hour lecture, actually from Craig Boyd, who is one of the co-writers of the book. So yes, you're reading the whole book, but I hope you figured out it's a pretty small book from that standpoint. And I know Craig pretty well, which means I have no idea what he's going to do. He can be mischievous sometimes, so just fair warning to everyone. And so be thinking about that. And I want to make sure I don't leave any other housekeeping on the table. You'll also have small groups again next week, so just keep working with the workbook from that standpoint. Okay. Thank you for your patience with me. John said, enjoy the beach. You know, it's only a Nazarene professor who would put, now I still have 26 hours of flight to arrive in Bali to spend 5 days in a conference room in the hotel with only 4 hours of unstructured time the whole time I'm in Bali. You know, I don't know if it's dedication or insanity. They tend to kind of conflate with each other from that standpoint. I'm just there to try to help the Asia Pacific region as they rethink clergy education. For some reason, they decided to bring me over. So we'll see. I'm more anxious to see how our conversations go forward. And I'll probably have a report on that, but not when I first arrive. I'll be too sleep deprived when I first get back for me to do anything for a couple of days. Okay. All right. Well, my prayers to everybody, and I'm going to step out. Maria will close out. If you want, I do think, does anybody want to move back into your small groups for any reason? I gave a promise if you just wanted to spend some time interacting with each other. No? Okay. Well, then I think we will call it. Maria, I'll let you just stop the recording and close us out. My prayers to each and every one of you. And I won't see you next week, but we'll see you in 2 weeks.